Hello, and welcome to Autumn's Notes app, where we explore all things written, filmed, and otherwise recorded for our collective research and yapping purposes. My name is Autumn, and today I'm going to tell you about some absolutely unforgettable books that I read in the first part of this year. This video is going to be more on the chatty side than the scripted side. I've got some bullet point notes on my thoughts for each book, but I kind of want to just talk. I'll have timestamps in the description if you want to skip around to a specific book that you want to hear about, but in general, my goal today is to convince you to read these books if you haven't already. With that said, there will be no spoilers aside from discussion of the base premises of each book and some general discussion of themes, but otherwise, I want you to go read these books without knowing what's going to happen. Let's get right into it. I almost forgot, I've got my dino friend with me today who will be talking about these books with me. So, with that said, let's get into it. The first book I want to talk about Is This a Cry for Help by Emily Austen. I've read all of Emily Austen's published novels, and Is This a Cry for Help is definitely my favorite. The book follows librarian Darcy, whose quiet life with her wife, Joy, is thrown into disarray when she learns about the death of her ex-boyfriend, Ben. Following a mental breakdown, she returns to work and tries to get back to routine, but is quickly confronted with a small group's mounting discomfort with the library's inclusive policies. Darcy is an extremely endearing protagonist. I really loved being inside her head, and I grew to feel a deep care for her, her emotional state, and all of the things that she was going through, especially at work. The way Austen writes her characters lends them each a very unique personality and narrative voice without sounding far fetched or over the top. Austen's female protagonists don't fall into the role of manic pixie dream girl or I'm not like the other girls or anything like that. They really come to life as people of their own, and I think Darcy's one of the best examples of that. This book does an incredible job portraying all kinds of different relationships, both passionate, current romantic relationships, relationships with people in the past when you were someone that you no longer identify with, and even platonic and familial relationships as well. For context, Darcy identifies as and understands herself to be a lesbian, but in the past, she tried very hard to fit herself into the mold of a straight woman, and that included her years-long relationship with Ben. It was really interesting to explore Darcy's reflective journey towards that relationship once she learns of Ben's passing, and a lot of that is done not just in her inner monologue, but also through her therapy sessions. The therapy in this book is written to be a very consistent and normalized part of the story. It's not treated as this extremely drastic thing that Darcy's going to therapy, but more so as a truly guiding and therapeutic experience for her that helps her work through a lot of her complicated feelings. Therapy is not just something that can be useful for people at their worst, and it's also not a matter of just go to a few sessions and you'll be fine. It takes time and effort, and I like that those sessions were portrayed real time throughout the novel, including dialogue from both Darcy and her therapist. I also thoroughly enjoyed this book's approach to social issues. I think it was a very accurate portrayal of the small vocal minority of dissenters who don't like the library's policies and believe they're pushing some agenda. Some parts really made my blood boil, but that's how real life book banning and fear mongering makes you feel. And I really valued seeing the perspective of library workers and how that would impact not only their mental health and workplace, but their ability to operate and offer people a safe space. If you're worried about reading this book because you feel like it would be too dark or depressing or too close to how things are playing out in the real world, you don't have to be worried. Even though Darcy and the people around her experience some difficult things in this novel, the ultimate feeling that you get at the end is hope. I came out of this book truly believing in the power of community, coming together, and of not letting a small vocal minority dictate how you feel about the causes that you believe in. I think it's very rare to read a book about real world social issues that doesn't make you feel worse about the state of society, but Austen accomplished that, and I think that's amazing. Most of all, I deeply appreciate that this is a queer story that doesn't focus on queer trauma. Darcy went through a difficult process of coming to terms with and understanding herself, but she's undoubtedly a freer, stronger person for living as she truly is, and that journey is never treated as this grueling experience. Heartstopper is widely celebrated as good representation for queer youth that doesn't solely focus on the potential trauma in the world. I think it's incredible and certainly a great start for mainstream media, but there should also be more media that portrays queer adults as people with full lives and conflicts, not just with struggles related to their identity and sexuality. I would certainly recommend any and all of Emily Austen's novels, but if you're looking for a place to start, Is This a Cry for Help is her newest and I would argue best work. The next book I want to talk to you about is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, which is the only book I have a physical copy of because I bought it and did not borrow it from the library. This book was actually first published in French in 1995, and this is a fairly recent English translation done by Roz Schwartz. To my knowledge, this is actually the first of Hartman's works to be translated into English, but I do think there are a few more that will be coming out over the next few years. I think Penguin Random House's UK Vintage imprint is working on some of those for the upcoming 100th anniversary of her birth. If you haven't heard of this book, the premise is that 39 women are being held captive in a cage with no understanding of why they're there and very few memories of their lives before they were taken. Our narrator, the 40th prisoner and a young girl, is very curious about the outside world that she never knew, but a lot of the women don't really entertain her questions because they don't see a point in teaching her a lot of things. However, her sharp mind quickly becomes critical when the group is presented with a chance to escape. I'm going to tell you up front, you probably shouldn't read this book if you don't like leaving a book without all the answers. Harpman does an incredible job of dropping little nuggets of world building here and there to make you question, to make you wonder, but she never gives you all the answers, and that can be frustrating, but at the same time, I think it's deeply relevant to the themes of the novel as a whole, and I am still thinking about this book more than 2 weeks after I read it. Our narrator, who is unnamed for the entire novel, has one of the most unique narrative voices I've ever read. I think that was truly necessary for this to be as impactful of a reading experience as it was, considering this child has grown up in captivity, has never known the normal world, has only ever lived in this underground bunker with 39 women. She shouldn't have a standard sounding narrative voice. She should sound like someone who has been raised in a very particular kind of isolation, and I think that was pulled off wonderfully. That's in part thanks to the incredible translation work, which I'll talk about as well, and also Harpman's clear, gifted writing skills. She is so adept with language, with description, with the way that she describes certain emotions and thought processes. I loved being in this character's head, and I would not have wanted to experience their journey as a group in the eyes of anyone else. I actually don't even want to tell you any more about how things play out or anything like that because I went into this book knowing virtually nothing beyond the bare premise, and I actually think that served to give me a greater reading experience. I was pulled into the novel the whole time because I kept wanting to know, wanting to find out what would happen next, hoping against all odds that there would be answers, even though I had a feeling there wouldn't be. And occasionally there would just be these one or two lines of absolutely devastating foreshadowing where I would just sit for a second and be like, did I actually just read that? Is that really what's going to happen? This is a shorter book, My copy comes in at 164 pages, but I would not necessarily call it a short read. I'm a pretty fast reader. Like, I could finish a 350 page book in a night, but this took me a little bit of time to read, not only because I think the text is a bit smaller on the page, but also because I wanted to absorb every word deliberately. I wanted to sit in the world, sit in the atmosphere, sit in the narrative voice, and understand everything that was going on so I didn't miss anything. So I will say, if you're just looking for a super casual, light read that you don't have to put much focus into, this is not that. This will need your attention, but I think it is worth every bit of that attention and more. If you have read this book, I would love to hear what you think in the comments. Just maybe put a spoiler warning at the top so that people who haven't read it know that they shouldn't read your comment. But if you want to know my thoughts, spoiler free, I choose to see messages of hope and humanity in this book. It can be really hard to leave a reading experience like this with hope in essence, but I choose, for the sake of my sanity, to find some positivity in all this. And honestly, Harpman's writing and this incredible translation, just what a reading experience, truly. I did say I was going to talk about the translation. Now, my experience with translated fiction mostly has to do with Japanese to English translated fiction, which I do intend to make a video of its own about at some point. I think this is the first French to English translation that I've read, and I think it's incredible. Of course, French and Japanese are very distinct, very distant languages. You can hardly compare the process of translating those languages to English, but I will say the translator, Schwartz, clearly has an incredible mastery of French language and English language in terms of the syntax, diction, phrasing, overall flow. If you told me this book had originally been written in English, I would have believed you. It's incredibly impressive work, and from the barest amounts that I know about translation, I cannot emphasize enough how much work clearly went into this to creating this smooth, absolutely seamless reading experience. I highly recommend you read this book, just be fully prepared to have an existential crisis afterwards. That's all I'll say. The last book I want to talk to you about is One's Company by Ashley Hudson. This book has been on my TBR list ever since I heard about it from Frankie's Shelf, who is one of my favorite booktubers of all time, if not my favorite booktuber ever. I kept looking for it at bookstores whenever I would go, and finally I was like, I can just get it at the library. Why am I going through all this trouble? So I did. The premise of the book is that our protagonist, Bonnie Lincoln, wins an unprecedentedly large amount of money in the lottery. And she decides that she is going to withdraw from society by recreating the set of her favorite show, Three's Company, and spending her remaining years living out each of the characters' arcs. Now, that is an absolutely wild, bonkers concept, and let me tell you, this book lives up to it and more. I have never watched the show Three's Company. I only know pretty much what was explained within this book, so you don't need any of the context going into that necessarily. But if you are a fan of the show, or if you know anything about it, I do think you'll have a much more involved reading experience than even I did, and I loved the book. I will say I'll give content warnings within this book for assault and an act of violence. It is not described in any kind of graphic detail, but it is referenced at multiple points as this was a very impactful event in Bonnie's life, no matter how hard she tries to suppress it. Like I said, it's not described in any kind of detail, but if that's something you feel like you can't read about, even in reference, that's totally understandable. This book would not be for you in that case. Bonnie is probably my favorite type of unhinged narrator, kind of similar to the narrator of Yellowface, where I acknowledge that their actions are unhinged and unhealthy, and escalating, and nevertheless, I can't help but root for them. It's a fascinating phenomenon that I don't think every author can pull off, but Hudson absolutely does. Bonnie has this extremely eccentric, extremely far fetched idea, and she throws herself into it with everything she has, which now includes, they never say how much. They never say how much she wins, but it makes it sound like it's like over $1 billion. So she puts her all into this, and this becomes her life essentially. Similar to I Who Have Never Known Men, I don't want to say any more than that because the way things played out in this book, the layers that unfolded, I enjoyed not being able to see them coming, and I actually think that led to a more rewarding reading experience. And you might be thinking, okay, but if she's gonna shut herself away from society and just pretend to be various TV show characters, isn't that gonna be a boring book? And the answer is no. Even though Bonnie is by herself for a majority of the narrative, there was, in my opinion, never a dull moment. I was constantly invested in how things were going, if they were running smoothly, the threats to her little world that she'd created for herself, and I never felt like the pace dragged just because she wasn't interacting with other people all the time. That in itself is a feat of Hudson's writing, in my opinion. This is her debut, by the way. I don't think I said that. This is Hudson's debut novel. I think she came up with a fascinating concept and had the writing chops to follow through, and I'm incredibly excited to read whatever she puts out next. I've seen reviews where people are like, I just don't get this variety of weird, or I feel like certain things weren't addressed with proper gravity, like her trauma, for example. I understand that. I can definitely see how people would have that perception after the reading experience, but it's just a weird book. It is a weird book, and that's not going to be for everyone. That's okay. But it was for me, and I think that if you think you are in a place to give it a shot, then you absolutely should. Because there's a chance you will love it just as much as I did. Love all of the wild shenanigans and Bonnie's unhinged plans. I really can't recommend this enough. As for her trauma not being addressed with the gravity it deserves, without giving any spoilers, I would argue that it is addressed in a serious manner. Not all the way through, but I would say it is addressed. And B, to me at least, it was obvious very early on that Bonnie has suppressed a lot of what's happened to her and is making an active, if subconscious, choice to pretend like it was any other event in life. Even if there are some ways in which she can't pretend that it hasn't changed things, she can treat it nonchalantly when it comes up in her thought process. And it read that way to me, that she was forcefully being nonchalant about it because it was a deeply impactful moment in her life, not that the author or the narrative was treating it as though it didn't matter. This was a shorter video, and as you can tell, filmed at night, very chill, very casual. I just wanted to tell you about some really cool books that I've been reading. I'm making an effort to read more this year. I've actually already surpassed, just this year, like in the first 4 months of 2026, I have surpassed the number of books that I read in all of 2025. And I know number of books read is not always the best or healthiest way to judge reading progress, but for me, last year I read far, far less than I normally read and would have liked to. Life got really busy. So it makes me happy that I not only have the time to put towards reading more books this year, but also that I have found some incredible reads that I will be thinking about for months, if not years to come. Please read these books if you haven't and come back to let me know what you think. If you have read these books, please let me know what you thought in the comments. I would love to hear if there were certain things you agreed with me on, And if you disliked any of these books or had problems with them, I'd love to hear about that too. Let's have a discussion. Make sure to follow my Instagram account, Autumn's Notes app, where I post book reviews for every book that I read, and some of those might end up on this channel, who knows? If you enjoyed this video or felt like you got something out of it, make sure to leave a like, and if you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe. That's all for today. I'll see you the next time I open my notes app. Bye!